I don't know why I do it either. Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to Fighting Words. Today, from the far eastern Oklahoma, we have Geoffery Beeson, Chief Instructor at Five Circles Martial Arts. Say hi, Jeff.
Hi, everyone.
All right. We've invited Jeff today because Jeff is a Japanese sword instructor, and he also participates in HEMA competitions, and we wanted to pick his brain on all the things we are doing wrong.
Should be very
right.
informative.
All the things
There's a
right.
plethora to choose from.
Non-controversial at all.
Yeah, no. Why would anybody have controversy about what we're doing wrong in HEMA tournaments?
Exactly. No, that would never happen.
No, nobody could ever get mad about that.
All right,
No.
Jeff, tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to competing in HEMA.
Oh, let's see. Where to start? Martial arts history in general. I think like everybody in Oklahoma, I did some Taekwondo when I was a kid. You know, and a few years of that. Seriously got started with my martial arts practice senior year of high school, around 18. Started up with my instructor. We do a Japanese-inspired and Japanese-based set of martial arts that encompasses basically the whole range of martial arts skills. So we work grappling and striking and weapon use. And we actually have two different paths of weapon study, which may be something to get into, maybe something interesting to get into, maybe not. And I've been working on that for about 20 years. And so, yeah, I mean, I maybe have developed a skill or two here or there, and have not embarrassed myself too badly. And so, yeah, I just, generally I love the martial arts. I love the community and mixing all of the knowledge around and figuring out who knows how to do what best. And so that kind of led me, I found out there was a group of people hitting each other with swords, and our swordsmanship style, our kenjutsu, is something that, not every form of Japanese sword art practice nowadays is even really intended to be an applied practice, but ours is. We take an approach where we try to apply our sword skills combatively. And so I found out that there were people swinging steel swords at each other. My first reaction was, well, that's just crazy. But, everything I've ever said, that's just crazy, I then also follow up with, but I got to give it a try at least once.
Yeah.
So my local HEMA group here in Tulsa, the chief instructor there is a good friend of mine, and so I met up with them and learned about steel sword fencing and decided that it was something that needed to be a part of my practice and something I ought to share with more Japanese sword art practitioners, because I think it's a hell of a lot of fun.
So tell me, what was it after you, because I'm assuming you met up with John Epler, is that correct?
So we're going to name drop. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, John.
John
We're
not
Epler.
scared of anybody on this show.
John. No, it's fine. John Epler of Tattershall, Tulsa, one of the finest and premier HEMA schools in Oklahoma. No, John has been a good friend of mine for a long time. And so I met up with John basically out at the park one day, and I was woefully underprotected, and John, because I had my kendo bogu, my kendo armor, which is great in certain spots and then completely lacking in others when it comes to the techniques that John was going to use. But he fought with a lot of really good control and gave me a couple of shots to think about, but nothing to regret. And
that first hit's still a doozy, though, isn't it?
It's like,
yeah. Well,
the non-padded part. It's like,
yeah. So I took one gentle shot to the fingers wearing the padded gloves that kendo uses, and that was I was just like, ooh, if that had been a shot with any sort of force, these gloves are meaningless in this context. And then I took a shot to the collarbone without any sort of collarbone protection, and again, John was fighting with great control, but I realized that I needed gear that was fit to purpose.
Yeah, because in kendo you have your kabuto, so that protects the head. The kote protects basically the arm to about halfway, and then the do just protects the front.
Yeah.
And
so there's and basically the men has a steel cage on the front. But then if you think like of a normal fencing mask, so you have the normal rounded kind of front, but then where the fencing mask has a steel cage rounded up over the top, the men just has padding at that point, and then there's nothing on the back. So if you take a shot to the top of the head, if you lean your head forward and take one on the top of the head, it can be pretty particularly nasty, even with a shinai. A shinai being the bamboo sword. I got to remember, not all of the listeners are of the weeb variety, so
it's okay. I'll interrupt you because I don't speak weeb. I don't. I missed that particular nerd gene, I guess. So I'm going to be clarifying for you. Now I want to put a pin in this because it's not the moment to talk about it. But aren't you working on some more protective gear and working with some people to work on that?
Yes. And
I was gonna say, so, I thought I've been drunk since then, but I thought I stood in your garage and admired a jacket.
Yeah,
right?
No, we are working on some Japanese inspired gear, and really that came out of this first couple of interactions with the HEMA community, because the next time I went out and played, I borrowed a jacket and I borrowed some various protective gear, and it was far more suited to purpose, but far less aesthetically correct. And as many in the HEMA community can appreciate, we want functional gear, but we also want it to match the aesthetic that we're going for.
Oh yeah, we're very expert. Why do you think we swing swords at each other? Oh my god.
Yeah.
We'll put a pin in that.
If you're not going to get dressed up, then what do you even do?
Make sure we mentioned it.
Yeah, because one of the things I wanted to kind of go with you was like, I know because I have a second degree black belt in karate, and we did some kabuto weaponry at the very end of it. And we never got past wooden weapons. We never got past like 2-man forms.
Okay.
So you weren't allowed to strike each other because, yes, we didn't have protective gear. So after you sparred with John that first time, what was your takeaway that made you? What did you start changing in your own training from that?
Well, historically the fencing that I had done had been with the bamboo sword, with the shinai. And, there is a very different, obviously it's a very different feel, trying to figure out all the best ways to describe it. If you haven't done a lot of fencing with a shinai, it's extremely live. It moves very fast. It bounces very readily. So, for example, deflecting a shinai, if somebody's holding the shinai out in what we would call chudan in a middle position, I guess maybe long point in longsword. Did I get a HEMA point there?
Yeah, kind of like post a breve long point-ish area.
Yeah, so holding it out along the center line out in front, with a shinai, taking that tip out of the center requires very little effort because their shinai bounces off very readily. With steel, the connection has to be more solid, and you need to have a little bit more contact. It really feels more, instead of a tap, it feels more like a push. I kind of picked up on that very readily, that the steel was it had more inertia. When it's in place, it's harder to move.
Do you feel like that's about binding technique?
No, because I don't bind. I mean, Japanese swordsmanship generally binding is not really, not the way that HEMA describes it, is not really a huge part of our technique. And I've had a number of HEMA fencers come back to me and say, part of the difficulty I had in executing some of my technique is that I kept trying to bind with you and you would never bind with me. Well, that's not part of our tradition.
Interesting.
Generally speaking. Now, one of the things I want to caveat and step out to give everybody a broader view is that, Japanese swordsmanship, Japanese martial arts, Asian martial arts get presented in the broader culture as extremely monolithic. Like Kung Fu is one martial art. No, it's not. It's like 700 different styles depending on what village you came from. Japanese swordsmanship is one thing. No, it's not. There are many different styles, many different approaches. You will not get two Japanese swordsmen from different styles together and get them to agree on just about anything. Everybody's got their own way of doing things. So any generalizations I make about, Japanese swordsmanship, take with a grain of salt, because
there's
lots of different approaches.
To compare what you're describing here with the multiple variations and hundreds of different styles, and depending on what village you're in, would that be fair to compare that to what HEMA practitioners would be familiar with between like the German longsword style versus the Italian and things like that?
You know, I think so. Now, this is where my lack of knowledge comes in, because I'm not an expert in HEMA by any stretch of the imagination. But the conversations that I've had with a German longsworder and an Italian longsworder, and talking about the different approaches that they take, my impression is that it's very similar. You know, but I think that the similarities between the different styles come from two places, and that's one, biomechanically, there's only so many ways to move the human body. So there are some underlying principles that are true no matter what style you're doing.
Well, we see that in wrestling manuals from all over the world, right? Yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And then the other piece is that you get similarities of style from using the same technology.
Right.
So
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So if we're both using a longsword, we're going to come to similar conclusions because of our technology and because our biomechanics are the same. But everything beyond that are really strategy decisions. Which biomechanics do you choose to employ? How do you choose to utilize that technology? So with Japanese swordsmanship, you know, the sword in some ways dictates the styles, because, you know, you have to come to certain natural conclusions because that's how that sword functions. But beyond that, and then beyond the similarities of biomechanics, that's where you get into all the strategic arguments, and there are lots of great stories, none that I am good at telling, but lots that I have listened to about, you know, how different styles got different monikers and different nicknames and have a different personality, and so, you know, again, just so I think it's a fair comparison to go all the way back to your actual question. Is that I think the German and Italian longsword differences, and then, you know, I've seen people posting research into English longsword. I don't know how much that's a thing, but
I'm fascinated by it. But yeah, it's not.
Yeah, you know, so it's like every new manual we discover, you know, every new source we discover is great, and it creates, you know, wonderful variation and serves the community better. So, but yeah, it's interesting. You know, I try to describe certain things about Japanese swordsmanship for people so that they can kind of get a general impression and understanding. And then I have to do that caveat, and I have to say, but look, you know, there's exceptions to all these rules. And there's this, you know, I tell you that Japanese swordsmanship doesn't do X. Somebody can bring forth a style that says, well, here, we do X. I'm like,
right.
Okay, fine.
Any statement you make, you're going to have a counterexample.
The way we do it at 5 Circles, based off of our research and our style, is this. I mean, being a karate do practitioner, I was a Shoryuken. If I went to a Shotokan, they did it differently. If I went to Kyokushin, they did it differently. Everyone has a reverse punch, but everyone has like a different setup, a different scenario, something like that. So we all have Oberhaus or a cut from above. It's just like, how are you using it on the offense? Are you using it on the defense? Are you primarily doing this? Are you seeking the bind with the cut, or are you using that as a setup? Because I judged a couple of Jeff's rounds at Gesellfesten last year, and you competed both single-handed with a katana and two-handed with a katana. And what?
Well, so when I did in the single sword competition, what I did was I used the katana one-handed, kind of by agreement of everybody, but I freely switched hands. So I would you know, drop into a particular stance, and what I would do is I would hold the katana at various times with two hands, but when I went to strike, I would only extend one hand. So you know, basically everybody was in their lighter jackets and their lighter protective gear, and I wasn't going to do a two-handed strike on anybody, and that was kind of the agreement. And then I did in the longsword competition, I did some kenjutsu with a longsword, which was funny to watch. So
it was, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we do, I'm kind of, my perspective on this is I'm very new to martial arts. I didn't grow up taking Taekwondo lessons because, well, I guess I didn't grow up in Oklahoma. So This is all very new to me. And I guess one question I have for you before we move on to the specifics of competition is, do you feel like with your Japanese sword fighting, you're part of a longer, more continuous tradition maybe than HEMA has been? Because I know that's one of the things we struggle with in HEMA is we had a couple 100-year gap where people didn't really practice this art, at least not in the way we have dojos across the country teaching Eastern martial arts. How do you feel like your Japanese swordsmanship relates to that?
So that's an interesting question, especially for me and for our style. So, we are what is called in Japanese martial arts a Gendai Bujutsu, which is a modern approach to the practice of Japanese swordsmanship, inspired by and on very common Japanese swordsmanship techniques. You'll see a lot of the same things that we do in the all Japan Kendo Federation forms and in their way of practicing both Kendo, which is the modern Japanese sport fencing, and Iaido, which is the drawing arts where they draw the sword and cut. So I mean, we're founded in those Japanese techniques, but and inspired by and pay homage to those Japanese origins, but we are not above and beyond further adaptation, further learning, further expansion. So when you ask, do I feel like I'm part of a longer living tradition? Perhaps, but I also don't see our practice as historical, which is an interesting distinction that I sometimes have with HEMA folks, because HEMA folks get very wrapped up about what's historical, and I don't really care.
To do that.
It's like I'm part of a long
living tradition of martial
artists that don't care what the last generation necessarily did. It's like we'll take from previous practices, but there's the martial art has to serve today. You can use martial arts as a form of historical preservation, and there are absolutely the Koryu styles, the old styles in Japanese swordsmanship and Japanese martial arts. They are very much about historical preservation of how it was practiced, and that goal of historical preservation overrides any sort of goal that's geared towards application towards life.
Kind of a martial application is overruled.
How that might be. So
interesting.
And I think that philosophy, like I'm not sure if it's an Oki thing or a Southern thing or just the people we tend to attract or whatnot, but it's like there is a spectrum of art, as in like a pure, like I like this crystallized version, and then a fluidic applicable version of the martial arts. And whenever we're talking weapons, no one is out killing each other with a long sword unless you're in Florida. So the idea, I just read an article the other day and I'm just like, God dang it, guys, calm it down.
So Florida, get your act together. You're making us all look bad. That's the takeaway.
And Josh Fury's on his way to Florida right now, so I hope he sees this eventually.
That's gonna make it worse. My God.
But like the ability, like, okay, we're taking from the historical sources and we're making it applicable to the modern day, which is like I'm wearing modern protective equipment, jacket, gloves, helmet, and I'm using either synthetic or blunted steel training version so that I can actually use this, because in the end we're not killing each other, so we need to find ways of making it work as closely as possible to the real thing, but with protection.
Yeah, and I would agree that that's kind of the attitude we tend to have here. Yeah. Thank you for humoring me and answering that question. I know that was a little bit off topic, but maybe one of these days we'll sit down and have a conversation about philosophy and culture issues. I think that's interesting, but it's probably outside the scope of a Fighting Words HEMA tournament podcast for the moment. So speaking of, let me take that moment to segue into your experiences specifically with HEMA tournaments. And I'm going to preface this with, I think the first time I met you, maybe not, I don't know, but one of the first times I looked across the gym at a tournament here in Oklahoma City, and there's some weeb with a katana in my longsword tournament. And I'm not going to lie, there's like a moment of resentment. I'm like, wait, no, it's not what we're doing. I have a longsword. Who's this weeb? What the hell?
German, I was like, who the f is that? And he was like, oh, that's a guy, that's that Geoffery guy that like Darrigan aspires. Like, Well, this is badass. I can't wait to see this.
So let me, with that as a preface and my bad attitude that I had to get over there for a minute, kind of as your intro. What's it been like competing against dorks like me with long swords with your katana? What's your experience been like? Yeah, is it a German weave? Am I German weave? Is that what that is?
You are German weave.
Deutscheboo.
Witchaboo.
Oh, Witchaboo.
Deutscheboo.
Deutscheboo.
Oh, I'm stealing that. We're Deutschaboos now.
See, I've been called a Sweetaboo before.
Oh, well, we're
all the Viking shit.
Oh, well, we're Deutschaboos now.
Okay, all right. Well,
cheers.
But to the question, what's it like picking up a katana, walking into a longsword tournament? Tell us about that.
So I have a long history of participating in martial arts tournaments. Generally, now they've traditionally been Asian martial arts tournaments, forms and sparring, but there's also been some Asian weapon martial arts tournaments that I've gotten to play in, and so I'm not unfamiliar to martial arts competition or tournament environment as a preface. So I'm not completely walking into this concept as some Japanese sword practitioners might, where they might have never done something like this before. But so I would say my experience and I'm going to broaden it out a little bit from, because is it Geoffery or how do you Beeson? All right, so Geoffery was the only HEMA tournament that I have had a chance to play in, but there's been a number of kind of competitive prize plays and stuff like that I've gone out and joined people in, and basically just I show up with my gear and my sword, and if somebody will let me hit them, then it's a good time. But I would say for one thing, I do need to give Jeremy and Kyle just a good word here, because the tournament was very well run, and it was very enjoyable. And so coming from a lot of very professionally run martial arts tournaments, it was good to show up to a professionally run martial arts tournament, because I've been to some unprofessionally run martial arts tournaments, and it's you can't get over that quite so easily to enjoy yourself in the actual competition when things are disorganized and nobody knows what's going on and nobody can answer your questions.
Yeah.
So great job. And so I am pretty competitive by nature, and I get probably too strongly competitive for my own good sometimes.
With the sword.
And so I really tried to make sure when I showed up to this tournament, I basically came to lose with that mindset. And let me say the reason why is because I'm coming into somebody else's house, and I'm coming into somebody else's practice, and I'm the outsider, and I've been invited in. And not only have I been invited into this thing that I have no experience in, but I've been allowed to bring my tool with me, and I'm gonna get to play with it, and everybody is welcoming. And so I was there to learn. I was there to learn and experience, and not necessarily to try my absolute hardest to win, because I don't know what the norms are, and the tactics or the actions or the behavior I might have employed to try to win may or may not be a norm for that community. So I came in very, very cautious and careful, and I did a lot of laughing at myself because I got hit in the head quite a lot. Tried to come at it with a good spirit and have a really good time. And the thing that was probably notable about it for me was that everybody there made that really easy. There wasn't really anybody I fought that, whether they thrashed me or not, and more often than not, they did thrash me, was just super gracious about it. And so it was a great environment for my first HEMA tournament to come into. And it was my first HEMA tournament, and it was probably like the 5th time I'd ever fenced with steel. And when I came in, I also, I wanted to come in humble, but I also didn't want to come in pretending like I haven't done 20 years of swordsmanship. So, talking about it with Jeremy and Kyle, we talked about, which division should I enter? And I entered into I can't remember what the name was, but the middle division. Like I didn't come in as a beginner, even though I'd never done HEMA really before, because again, 20 years of swordsmanship, I didn't feel right beating up on beginners. And so I was fencing with some really capable folks. And I learned a lot, and I lost a lot, and I had a lot of fun. That said, I know that my mindset when it comes to that sort of thing may not be maybe towards the unique side of things. I tend to be pretty gracious about that kind of stuff, but that was my experience. I just had a really good time, and everybody was really great, and I just came to have fun.
Now out of curiosity, do you remember who was in your pool? Anybody specifically that you fought? I'm curious. I watched a lot of your fights, and I'm trying to remember who all you fought.
I'm trying to. It's been over a year now, and
sure, I understand.
Oh God, I think Garrett Baker was definitely in one of them. I know I fenced with Derek in single sword, and I got a point on Derek in single sword, and that's actually like I have a plaque on my wall now that says Geselfechten 2019 scored point on Derek Jeff Beeson. I got it for myself. They weren't handing out those sports at the tournament.
I mean, every time I have to fight Derek in a tournament, I'm just like, well, here we go.
Yeah. Well, we're going to chalk one up to we should have done a little more research and looked at who his matches were before we did this. But I want to add, like, you were clearly the most talked about and most watched fencer at Geselfechten 2019. I think that's pretty clear because I think a lot of us had a reaction like I did when you showed up and stepped into the ring with a katana.
As soon as you see a guy in a HEMA with
and I want to say, like, I was wildly impressed. My gut reaction was weird because I wasn't expecting it. I think Jeremy was planning on that and didn't tell a lot of us it was going to happen.
Yeah.
But the moment I saw it and got to sit there and watch you fence, like, it was clear that this was not something you were used to. It was clear that you hadn't fought a lot of people with long swords before, but there was I loved it. I loved watching you fence. It was super fun. It was fresh. It was interesting, and you were clearly in your element, but playing our game. Yeah, and that was kind of cool to watch. I really enjoyed.
Speaking of your game, I wanted to ask, like, what were some of the strengths that you feel like you brought into your competition?
Where I seem to do well is in the game, the game that I play, the way that our martial arts gets applied. I have different combat lines, different paths of attack than most HEMA folks are used to. And so my distance management and my level change is something that has surprised a few HEMA folks. I mean, some of my most successful points are going in and almost inviting that longsword practitioner to bind with me. And especially if I can get them to lift their arms up and kind of into a high kind of bind, and then all of a sudden I just disappear underneath and cut them through the gut as I walk past them. That's one that's
hate it. I hate it already. I haven't fought it
yet. That's one that I've done a number of times, and my ability to do that diminishes very quickly after I've done it once or twice because HEMA guys realize that I'm not actually going to bind with them. They stop settling into, okay, it's binding time. They're like, nope, sorry.
And in our southern style, in our southern style,
what that was.
At least in Oklahoma, we love the binding game really
very much so.
Like our early KDF sort of background is like cut, and if you don't hit them, you bind, and then you bind and wind. And so like watching you just completely like, it was like the guy's going like, oh, I'm going to feel you out, and you're just like, oh, that was cute. There goes your wrist. It's like,
I don't want you to touch my sword ever, and I'd rather not my sword touch anything but you.
God, there's so many jokes I want to make right now. I'm just going.
Oh, no.
All right, but yeah, like
it's
that was
the after hour podcast.
So that was very interesting to watch because it's like, okay, you got a guy who's coming forward at you, and he's getting way closer than you want him to, and it's like, okay, well, I'm going to bind him because we're taught bind creates safety with that bind, so I know where your sword is, so then I can get you. And as soon as they would try to do that, you were just like past their weapon because yours is shorter and like hitting them, and they're like, whoa, what the? So then their distance management is so off, and that's what I really love to watch people's brains fry. Watching this guy come in and just like dee, 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 and you were just like so like straight on, and most of us are like can to the side, can to the left, all right, circle a little bit, and you're just like, hi, how are you doing? Oh, okay, well that's over. Like,
yeah, I heard one of your opponents describe you as a ghost.
Yeah.
Like they didn't know where you were at any given time.
Yeah,
like they were trying exactly what you're describing. They were trying to bind you out. They were trying to stay safe in the way that we're taught in that German longsword tradition. And your Japanese sword fighting had no care for that. It just went right past it.
The yokai of Tulsa. It's like, oh, he is Ghost.
Tulsa.
Oh, do not fight yokai of Tulsa.
Yeah. So I want to hear the flip side now.
Yokai is a monster or spirit or demon in Japanese. So.
Yep.
Oh, cool. There we go. I was just assuming.
You're not a weeb.
I'm not, man. I can't even get into anime. I've legitimately tried, and I just can't get there.
See, this is like the god nerd of weebness, because like I was from like 12 to like 26. I was obsessed with Japanese culture. And then I got out of being an instructor and doing karate all the time, and I got into the Filipino martial arts, and I found longsword. It's like, oh, something else. And so I got really big into being the Doishibo at that point. And now it's like beating someone who kept to the sacred path is very nice.
Okay, so while we're still talking specifics about your interactions, and I understand we're talking about one tournament, and that's kind of a small sample size, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. What's the flip side of that question for you? So that was your strength, and I think we all agree. We watched you fight. What would you, and I know it's crappy to tattle on yourself, but what were your weaknesses? What did you come into that tournament and then leave going, oh, this is the thing that German longsword fighters can hit me with?
Well, and so one of the things that, and it's still a learning experience for me, is that it the steel blades require a different set of behavior, and it's interesting. I've talked to folks about when through my various steel fencing experiences with HEMA folks, there are techniques within our style which are almost throwaway techniques, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to teach you this technique, you do this thing, but chances that you'll ever pull this off on somebody are extremely low. And that's because the Kenjutsu practitioners that I normally fight against and fighting with Shinai are not super suited to that technique, but I have found those throwaway techniques become suddenly very useful when we're talking about steel and somebody with a heavier and longer sword. And I'm like, oh, these techniques are there for a reason. Anyway.
Yeah.
But I would say that I'm still adapting to steel. And so there are a lot of times where I make a deflection, or I try to clear the center line, and the sword just doesn't move as much as it should. It's like physics doesn't feel the same using a steel sword, and so I still just make bad judgments. When I'm fighting longsword, I 20 years of katana and shinai length weapons I have programmed me to a certain read of distance. And so sometimes I think I'm 2 inches out of range and I get hit and I'm like, oh yeah.
What is the length difference? I'm just for our viewers and myself, because I don't know.
One shoku.
A normal fetter probably clocks in somewhere around 42 inches?
Yep.
Yeah, so a shorter katana, you're probably talking about 36, medium range 36 to 38 inches, 29 to 30 inches of blade, 8 inches of handle.
Yeah.
And so that's significant. I can see the difference there.
Yeah, and Shinais are definitely a little bit longer, but it's still, I just, for some reason, the longsword reach, I don't quite read correctly. There's also some biomechanics, the way you guys extend your arms in a cut that is it adds some extra reach that I'm not anticipating. So even when I read the sword correctly, sometimes I miss out on that biomechanic, that arm extension.
Yeah.
And I get hit again because I'm bad at reading all of the intricacies of the distancing in this context. Don't have as much problem with the distance reading when it comes to like side sword and saber. Those things are a little bit easier to read for me. When I was doing side sword and saber, though, in my experience there, one of the things I'm trying to overcome is there are some really funky lines that I'm just not good at reading. What we would call a reverse entry cut, so a cut that rises to the left, but actually is going to end up cutting from the right. And so we would call that a reverse entry cut. And it's something that we do and we can do. We just don't do a whole lot of. And so I don't have as much, brain muscle connection there to say, oh, this is going to be a threat from this side.
Right.
And so I'm still getting used to that. And so I get hit quite a few times by surprise, going, wait, that wasn't the line I was predicting. I put my sword over here. So
yeah.
So I would say the distance management, or reading the distance and reading the combat lines, because of the way that you guys just do things differently, has been tricky and gets me hit a lot.
One of the things that I want to point out before we move on to the next section is, like, my noticing, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of cuts with, like, the katana, your arms are going to be a little bit more bent, and it's more of in the German tradition we call it abschneiden, or the slice.
Yeah.
So it's like we're draw cutting through things, versus in the German system the hauen, or the hew, is more of a cast out and like pluck something off, versus like hit it and draw through the target.
Yeah.
So I notice a lot more when people would cast their shots out, it would hit you more, because not only do they have like a hand's length more on their blade, but also you're used to that close quarters cut, which whenever you would get past their tip, it was just like, well, they're pretty much dead at this point. But if they could keep you out at that range and cut from like using the stroots and whatnot from the odd short edge angles, like, it was more successful. But whenever you got past that, I mean, you were on someone like.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me. I'm going to jump in with one more like real specific question before we move on to the philosophy stuff. It's interesting to me that in our strength and weakness section, you mentioned distance. Like, that was kind of if you'll forgive the terrible wordplay, kind of a two-edged sword, it sounds like for you. Because your opponents talked about how weird it was that you closed so far, and they had trouble defending against that, because that's not what they're used to. And you're sitting here telling me that you felt like you got hit when you thought you were out of range. So on that small sample size again, but in that one tournament, do you feel like that was more of a benefit or more of a liability for you?
Well, so let me. I think it was probably evenly weighted. I mean, I think the points that I got from my successful distance management and closing and changing the combat line to a place that was unfamiliar. And then the times when I lost, it was when I sat back and allowed the long sworder or the single sworder or side sworder or whatever to play their game. And that would, I would say that when it comes to, and this is where we start to get into some of the, Japanese swordsmanship is not monolithic, but Japanese swordsmanship very much tends to be about distance management. That is the game. I mean, it is not fencing. So if you think of kenjutsu or kendo, think of modern kendo, sport fencing, the guys in the armor with the shinai, and then you think of modern European, foil or saber fencing or whatever. The sword contact in kendo is incidental, and they're trying to avoid it at all costs. And the sword contact in European fencing is the point of what's going on. You have to parry riposte. And the reality is that in a lot of the, in kendo, the way the rule set kind of works, and I'll probably have kendo guys send me nasty emails, but the way the rule set basically works is they ignore and disregard all shots that are not the ideal perfect shot. And so you'll see kendo guys fighting each other, and one will throw a shot to the head, and one guy will duck his head to the side and take that shot on the shoulder. And because that wasn't a perfectly executed shot, there's no point called, and they just keep fighting. If you throw a shot at my head and I get my shinai on it, even if you make contact with my head, the fact that my shinai was in the way means that it's less than an ideal shot, and it probably won't get called.
Interesting.
And so they just keep fighting until somebody gets that perfect shot, and you have to hit.
That's exhausting.
Yeah, when you look at, well, and it doesn't take too long, but when you look at the shinai, there's a part at the end of the sword. There's a leather collar, and then there's the tip, and so there's this space between the leather collar and the tip, which is called the monouch, or the striking place, the striking point.
The weak and
And
long sword. Yeah.
you have to hit with that point to score your point. It's one of the various characteristics that judges are going to look for. So, if I get too close to you, it's really hard for you to hit with that point. If I'm making you overreach, then it's really hard for you to get a timed shot in a way. So distance management and that explosive entry is very much the name of the game in Japanese swordsmanship, generally speaking, for a non-monolithic art.
All caveats required.
Jeff is a lawyer, so he has to make sure to clarify himself.
Yeah. Longsword, and European fencing in general seems to have a lot of sword-on-sword contact, and I'm going to create my opening by manipulating your weapon or getting you to manipulate your weapon for me. And, in Japanese swordsmanship, I generally would like to ignore your weapon and just, make sure it's somewhere else when I do what I want to do. And some of this, and we can have a whole other discussion about the katana as a technology and the steel, behind it. And God, there's enough videos and podcasts out there about it.
Yeah.
But as a technology note, the katana was really, and again, let's go back. Katana is not a monolithic weapon either. At various points, it had different lengths, it had different curvatures, different size handles. Different fencers, different swordsmen would have their katana made to the specifications that they want. It's not one weapon. But one common characteristic that you see is that differentially hardened edge, where they clay temper the edge so that the edge gets a lot harder than the back of the sword. So the sword is flexible and malleable, but the edge is super hard, so it has a really good sharp forward edge. And part of that is actually part of the reason they did that was because of some of the defects in the steel that they had available, not because it was so fantastic.
It was super sharp, super hard, but it could chip easily. So the perfect cut is developed so that you don't break your weapon, because if you've ever looked at the wood prints, other people, there are shattered blades and chipped. It looks like a bandsaw at this point.
Interesting.
So because this kind of like, you just sparked an old memory in me. Like my instructor talking about, like the reason why we would, with the Jo staff, we would block, but with the katana, we would always dodge or like flat parry or back edge parry, is because your edge was like on a timeline. Like if you've had to pull this one, your bow is gone, your horse is dead, your spear is gone, your retainer is probably dead too, because he would have your backup weapon, and you're having to pull this thing out because either you're in a duel or shit has hit the fan.
Interesting.
But this thing's on a timeline, because if you just edge bash, get about 6 edge bashes in there, and you basically have a hacksaw.
Yep.
Or it's
no, the edges chip. I mean, people have chipped their edges cutting tatami mats with differentially hardened katana. They're great cutters. They're super sharp. But so part of what this does is this means that edge to edge contact is, it's just going to destroy the swords. And
wildly undesirable.
Steel and iron is far more precious a commodity in Japan throughout history than it is in Europe. I mean, people are like falling by the roadside and accidentally finding iron. It's like in Japan, they had to dig up this sand and smelt the iron out of the sand, and so it's super expensive, and the edge is destroyable in a single edge to edge contact. So all of my deflections, for the most part, are with the side or the back of the sword. Or if I'm going to take my edge to your sword, it's going to be the edge to the side or to the back of your sword. I'm going to avoid your edge like the plague.
Yeah, because there are plays in the German longsword, especially like in the 16th century. I mean, and by then, swords were so much more common that the middle class is having access to them, compared to like earlier stuff where only like the higher class would. And like edge-on-edge contact, despite what some masters in the modern era say, would happen. And like we have examples of chipped-in blades and stuff where they've been either polished out or like they have the divots still in them from like being used. And it's like this was a common approach, because unlike a Japanese sword where this is more of a rarity and more of an honor to have. Like this was just like your Glock 19. Oh, well, either fix it or let's find something else and put it on my handle because I like that. So let's get into like how can you, I would say, could blah, 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 blah,
Start
blah.
that one over.
Okay. Things that you think that we could combine from maybe the Japanese style or the style of training that y'all guys that could be brought into HEMA that could help improve the HEMA scene in total.
Yeah, the quintessential outsider question. I mean,
yeah,
sure.
What could we steal from you that would make us better?
Yeah. So well, and I think you know, one of the things that I have found that you know, it goes back to that distance management conversation and that evasion as a primary form of defense. Mm-hmm. You know, before I deflect, before I oppose, I'm always going to try to evade. Mm-hmm. Evasion doesn't require the commitment of my sword. If I can evade your blow, I can use my sword freely, and so you know, there's no need for contact. So there are certain evasion drills that we practice, and there are distance management drills that we practice that I think, you know, could benefit a lot of folks in the HEMA community. I think some of our handedness drills, you know, the longsword seems to very decidedly be a two-handed weapon, mm-hmm. And that's fair. The katana and even the longer forms, the odachi or the nodachi, they're far more free to let go with one hand or the other and rapidly switch in between. Mm-hmm. And that was actually one of the things that really hurt me during the tournament when I was using the katana, is that I did not have gloves that were worth a crap. Crap, okay? I'm gonna say crap.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Oh, we say.
And so there was a couple of times that I actually embarrassingly threw my sword because the gloves that I had were just awful. And so being able to quickly shift my hands and change, you know, what hand I'm working with, because one of the things that does, and one of the ways that I do the whole, you know, drop out and ghost thing, is when I remove one hand from the sword, my range can be compressed super tight. And so I can cut you while we're almost standing chest to chest because I go to a one-handed cut. And so then the other thing that I can do is I can extend my range, especially with my left hand, which sits at the base of the sword. When I'm cutting at you two-handed, I can establish a particular range between us, and I can let go with the right hand and suddenly reach a lot further using that one-handed cut. So I think some of the handedness drills, some of the evasion drills, some of the distance management drills, all could be fun for HEMA people to play around with and see how it expands their understanding of fencing. Some of the passing drills, some of our combat line drills might also be fun to play with. We haven't really talked about the combat line much, but you'll see in kendo and in modern or in Japanese swordsmanship in general, you'll see two people come at each other and go past. I mean, that's like one of those samurai movie tropes, right? It's like they run past each other and one falls dead. Well, I mean, it's you know, things are a trope for a reason, and that's because you know, in the fact, you know, again, because the fact of evasion and the fact of I don't want to be where your sword is kind of really inherent and strong in the Japanese sword arts. One of the best places to be is behind you. And so when I do an aggressive action, I drive straight at the target, but I don't, like in a lot of HEMA practices that I've seen, as I understand it, I don't drive in and then jump back out again. I drive in and carry on through. Yeah. And I don't turn around to face you again until I'm well out of your range and we can reset to zero. Right. So that's that whole running through the target kind of drill. So that drill could be interesting to play with because that's not a combat line like that HEMA tends to do.
How you would set up a drill like that for HEMA practitioners? How would you teach that to me, somebody who has absolutely no experience with Japanese swordsmanship but is pretty familiar with a longsword?
Sure. Okay, so you're going to start beyond beyond my is combat distance in Japanese. So you're going to start beyond your basic combat distance, further out than basically whatever your comfort exchange place is.
Right.
And you're going to start outside, and the aggressor is going to run or move quickly, or you're gonna have to, with your footwork. It's like I can tell you how to do it with my footwork, but with your footwork, you need to advance very, very quickly. And then when you get to the point of making your attack, there's an explosive step. Now, HEMA tends to make an explosive step with a lunge, and a lunge is contrary to continuing forward movement. It gives maximum extension, but then it's really hard to keep moving forward after that. So our basic sliding step, our basic or jumping step, when we go to that moment of attack, I take that huge jump with my forward leg, and my back leg trails. It follows along, and so I end up in a stance that is just like I started in. I'm not in an extended lunge position.
Oh, I see.
And so when you make that explosive, you approach quickly, you make your explosive step, and then you take the next step with the left foot, or with the back foot. So if I'm right foot forward, I jump with my right foot, and then as soon as I land, whether I made that shot or not, I immediately follow left, right, left, right, left, right, and I just carry on through. Okay. And then I turn around and I do it again.
So like a lunge where you're not anchoring your back foot.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Is that a fair comparison?
That's a fair comparison. Yeah, it's a lunge where you're you're gonna, we call it a sliding step. Basically my one foot steps forward, and then the other step quickly slides behind.
In JKD, we call that a push shuffle. So we push off the back foot, and then we quickly shuffle the other foot, and then we would just run after that. So
yeah. As somebody with only HEMA martial arts experience, that is incredibly new and fascinating.
We're totally going to practice this whenever.
And so you can have the defender stand in the middle, and you can have just one person just constantly make this running attack. And this is a good drill for somebody from a defensive standpoint, because they're going to get somebody that is giving 100% commitment to a single strike. Somebody is going to jump at them and try to hit them, and they can work deflections, they can work evasions, they can work whatever defense it is that you guys want to work. So the person in the middle works their defenses and their evasions. I would avoid on this particular drill a counter strike. Just work on so that we don't end up clashed and stuck, because one person is trying to pass through, one person just tries to make sure they don't get hit.
The drill
you can also do this. You can also do this with a circle. So you set a bunch of artists on a big circle with one in the middle, and people just run at the guy in the middle from all directions.
That's interesting.
Could you imagine us doing this?
Man, I'm thinking of the drills we do with the two-sided defense.
Right, where we have to go back and forth. But man, if we circled everyone up and like had people jog and then yelled their name and they'd run in there,
that's my God.
That would be fun. No, so if you it's a very different practice, but if you ever one of the terms for a drill that's kind of like this is called randori. It's used a lot by the Aikido guys. So I mean, not advocating for Aikido or for doing Aikido things in HEMA or whatever, but this particular drill, they have a circle of people around them. Somebody runs in an attack, and they have to deal with that. As soon as they're done dealing with that, the next person is coming in. They deal with it. The next person is coming in, and it's coming from all angles. So you're constantly having to readdress. And the people that are attacking are practicing that through combat line. They get to just rush in, give their all to an attack, and then move on through.
Yeah, I mean, we did that in Arnis. So like you would have someone charge in, and you knew what technique you were doing. It's just they're charging in, and their job is to crack you in the head, and your job would be either to deflect them, hit their hand, disarm them. And as soon as you're done with that guy, the next dude's in, and the next dude's in. But when you did disarms, you had sticks all over the ground, so it becomes
This is so cool. This conversation is so interesting because I am personally excited hearing new things, learning new things that we can try to incorporate into our training and make ourselves better and more versatile. But I'd like to apply the same logic. This is kind of our last big question to talk to you about before we wrap up the interview, is what do you feel like you can bring to our tournament scene? And again, I've said small sample size like 5 times in this interview because you've only been to the one tournament, and I just want to remind people of that.
But you've been to tons of others.
But yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and pick on us. We're some Brogy. Like, tell us about our tournament and the things that would make it. What are things that you feel like were particularly well done, and what are things that you feel like from your background would help us attract more practitioners, more variety, and improve our tournament scene?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Well, I think that you guys have a really good rule set, generally speaking. And I'm a huge advocate for as many different rule sets as we can come up with, because every rule set is going to weight and influence a particular set of behavior. And so the more we can make people play the game differently, the better. So I like your rule set, and I wouldn't suggest that we do different rule sets at a single tournament, but be aware how your rule set is geared towards HEMA and is geared towards your particular goals. And so when you get input from outsiders, you just be open and receptive to it. Now, I don't have specific feedback for you guys on what I experienced or changes to your rule set that I'd recommend. But we always want to be cognizant of the fact that no ultimate rule set. There is no right rule set, and so it all is just a series of compromises. Every time we make a rule set, it's like, okay, are we going to compromise to get more of this, or are we going to compromise to get more of that?
Right.
And
I think
so,
we were talking about, like, there was Japanese martial arts is not a monolith.
Yeah.
And like all the different schools have different emphasis and different styles. I think
very much so. That
is healthy for the HEMA community to do that and have different rule sets, because if we all had the exact same rule set, then we would become this like homogenous pool of just everyone does exactly the same thing because it's based off that rule set.
Yeah. Well, if the technology is the same, if the biomechanics are the same, and if the rule set is the same, then you're going to reach the same conclusions. Everybody that has a lick of fighting sense can look at a weapon they're going to use, going to look at the rule set that they're going to play under, and come to very similar conclusions about what things are going to be successful. And I know people get pissy about gaming rules, but as soon as you have rules, it is now about gaming them. It is now about figuring out how to utilize those rules for.
And we do that with normally. That's where the styles come from, is we're gaming reality. It's like, I'm wearing armor and you're not.
Way to say that. I agree. I agree.
Yeah. So, I would say if I had any frustration with HEMA as I've experienced it so far, is and it's not unique to me. It's pretty common in the conversations I see in the HEMA community. But the nebulousness of doubles and afterblows and how to deal with those, in our particular rule set, the way that we play, the first cut is the victorious cut, and if it's a simultaneous cut. Okay, it's a simultaneous cut, but if one was superior to the other, you cut my hand and I chop you in the head, you know what? I get to go home at the end of that day. You don't. Right. So we do prioritize our targets when we're deciding a double, like a simultaneous strike. So if you hit me in the hand as I hit you in the head, I'm going to win that exchange. Right. And so after blows. Our general rule for how we deal with after blows is not really one so much of time. We don't talk about tempo. We talk about momentum. In order for an after blow to count, the cut has to be in motion before the first strike was made.
Which is a discussion in HEMA too. Some people make that distinction. and I think people try to talk about it using terms of timing, but I think
momentum, because
we play into that.
You me and I'm just like,
yeah. Now, if my arm is already swinging and you pop me in the head, there's no guarantee that my arms are gonna stop swinging.
Right. Yeah.
The sword already has kinetic energy into it.
Right.
So we look for, was there kinetic energy prior to? It's not so much about would one person be dead. You know, I see that in the conversation a lot. It's like, well, you can still kill somebody after you get stabbed, and like, well, okay, yes, but you know, we can't. One of the things that we can't do is we can't in any way, shape, or form simulate injury.
Right.
You know, it's like I can't. So I hit you in the head. Was that a glancing blow off the side of your head, or did that cut your brain right down the middle? We'll never know.
Which comes again to the point about gaming. Anytime you codify rules, there is a game to be played.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure, I understand that.
And I mean,
so
the way
I
they got around
think
that
my
was
frustration with the HEMA rule sets as I've experienced them so far is the same frustration most HEMA practitioners have, and that's that there is no perfect solution. There is no perfect rule set. You know, I would challenge the HEMA community to break as many paradigms as often as they can, as far as, you know, what rules are going to be utilized. So I was, you know, I was talking about how interesting it would be to use more modern kendo rules in a HEMA context and say, look, there is not going to be a stop to this fight until one of you executes a perfect unanswered cut. It's just going to keep going until somebody gets it right, you know, and that rule set.
Bring my Tylenol.
Yeah, I was gonna say I can imagine some fights. I've been in some fights that got real messy, and that would have been a hard hurdle to overcome.
Well,
all right, I got one more specific question. We're wrapping up the end of the hour, but I do want to get this one more specific question out before we talk about your current projects and things like that and wrap this up. From a culture standpoint, which is something that matters to me personally and to a lot of HEMA practitioners, I think a lot of us care very deeply about the culture, and a lot of us, it turns out, I've had conversations with you and with other people.
Unfortunately.
We like diversity. HEMA is a community that tends to like diversity and new things, and I have been excited by your additions to our local Oklahoma HEMA culture, and a lot of other people have too. What could HEMA do to encourage more people like you to be part of what we're doing in kind of a cultural way?
Yeah, so I would think, like, you know, like most things cultural, one of the first barriers is language.
Okay.
And you know, not to say, I mean, there should be HEMA tournaments and there should be Kenjutsu tournaments and competitions where that's the thing. If we want to encourage more open play, we have to use open terms.
Okay.
So HEMA by itself is just linguistically limiting both in culture and it's limiting in approach, meaning it's a historical European approach. So if I am a longsworder that has developed a longsword style that has nothing to do with history, I already feel like an outsider to the term HEMA, even though I'm using the same weapon.
Okay, yeah.
You know, and so I am a modern Asian practitioner. So HEMA is the like diametric opposite of me. Now, I have been welcomed into the community. I mean, and that's awesome, and I feel welcome, and I feel, you know, like appreciated. But I could never say that a HEMA tournament. I am a visitor at a HEMA tournament. I never feel like a HEMA tournament is for me. So if we want to create tournaments and we want to create competitions that are going to bring in Filipino martial arts practitioners and Japanese martial arts practitioners and Chinese martial arts practitioners and African martial arts practitioners and all of these various cultures that are reviving their traditional weapon arts, or have continuing living traditions. If we want to create spaces where everybody actually feels welcome, the first thing is call it something other than a HEMA tournament.
Do you have a suggestion for that?
You know, I've been talking with a few folks about this extensively, and you know, one of the terms that I kind of come back to is combat fencing. It is you know, it is fencing. It is the art of defense with a weapon, but it is not necessarily sports-oriented fencing, and we want to distinguish it from modern fencing.
Well,
So combat fencing is one of the things, and I thought about combat steel fencing, but I think that there are places, especially because one of the other things we want to do, I think, as a practice community, is make sure that we've maximized accessibility.
Right.
And there are folks that are just never going to be comfortable or happy with the steel fencing idea.
Right.
Synthetics or foam, I mean, there's a place for those practices. They're not.
I'm going to interrupt you because I want to reference back a couple episodes ago. We interviewed Sky talking about her youth tournament that I actually took a team of public school youth fencers to, which I'm very proud of, and I would love to talk about more, but this is not the episode for it.
Yeah.
And that was a synthetic tournament. It was purely synthetic. The students we had a bunch of 12 to 14-year-olds, and they were hitting each other not with steel swords. We decided, Sky decided, and I went to the tournament, so therefore agreed that these kids should be hitting each other not with steel, but with synthetic. And that tournament went, I was leery of it. It sounded weird to me when she told me, but it went wonderfully.
Yeah.
And that was your term accessibility there means a lot to me as a teacher, as a coach of young fencers. I did take a couple of fencers to Texas for that tournament that I do not think they could have mentally stood up to a full gear steel tournament, and they were able to very successfully participate in something because of that accessibility. So yes, thank you for saying that. Yeah. All of that.
Well, and so agree. there's young people, there's old people, there's people with disabilities, and then there are. I mean, we need to be honest about our practice and the world that we live in. Traumatic brain injury is an issue. Yeah. And doing the football thing and ignoring TBI like it doesn't exist. Yes. Until we have fencers that have finally been doing it for 40 years and are having, serious brain problems. We have to respect that, it's like one of my best friends, one of the best martial artists that I know. He and I have not a falling out, but he and I have a disagreement over the fact that I've chosen to go forward with steel fencing. And he says, look, I'm never going to do it because I don't have any interest in having my brain rocked by a steel sword. Okay. And I said, you know what?
I can understand.
But you still deserve a place in the practice. You still deserve a place in the art. I'm going to try to figure out how to make a space for you, even though you don't want to, it doesn't make you less of a fencer because you don't want to do this steel thing.
This is your area that you are comfortable in. And it's not like we're having to train this because we're going to go kill each other. We've talked about this before, where it's like this is a willing participation. No one's being forced to be here. And if this is not how you want to play the game or practice, that's fine. I mean, I like the idea because one of the things I talked with some people about was dropping the E out of HEMA and just historical martial arts or historical weapons martial arts, because we're using weapons that are historical because no one is currently using a katana that I know of or a longsword in a modern combat theater. So I think the name change would be good if we were going to help incorporate more people, because there's a guy named, I think, Damon. He does HEMA, which is a form of historical African martial arts. Oh, interesting. And I think it would be great to have, because a synthetic tournament, because of Purple Heart Armory, they have synthetic swords out the wazoo. And we could be like mixed open synthetic, and like we could have the Filipino martial artists, we could have the Japanese, the Chinese. They have hook swords. We could have the traditional African martial arts. We could have Indian martial arts. We could have the whole gamut.
But I think it's important to say, and I'm going to go ahead and jump in with this, that changes what it is.
When
you walked into Gesselfest in 2019 and stepped into the ring with a katana, you changed the game. This is no longer a longsword tournament, realistically.
Now and I agree. And so I think that there needs to be, not everything needs to be an open all weapons tournament. Not everything needs to be all things to all people. We don't need to have a synthetics division at every tournament that we host. But when we talk about bringing more people in, accessibility is the key. So, my first term was accessibility in the language. HEMA by itself is a limiting term. So a combat fencing tournament, like I said, I thought about combat steel as a combat steel fencing as a term, but thought just adding the word steel in there is now excluding all these other practitioners. The other term that I've heard is mixed weapon martial arts.
Heard that one too.
And Bryant Costin down in Texas, and Eddie Lopez, a couple of guys that I've had a number of. Who else was I discussing this with the other day? I'm gonna totally forget his name at the moment. Anyway, but mixed weapon martial arts is another term. That one I have a little trouble with, just because I don't really want association with mixed martial arts.
Right. Yeah.
So
it's different feel.
Language is important. I think that one of the things we can do to bring more people in is open up the language, so it doesn't feel like they're a stranger at a HEMA tournament. It feels like they are a participant at an open tournament, if that's what you want to do. And then the other thing is we need. We can use this to segue into my projects if you want, but
let's do it.
We need to work on standards, is maybe the wrong word, but we need to work on technology that everybody can bring to the conversation, everybody can bring to the event. So, if I'm a Filipino martial arts practitioner, I use rattan sticks all the time.
I'm so sorry.
All right.
All right, we're good.
All right, we're dealing with some technical issues on our side anyways, it looks like. So
Okay.
Finish your thought real quick. We'll segue into your projects and then wrap it up pretty quick. Sorry.
No, sure. So anyway, what I was saying was that, if I'm a Filipino martial arts practitioner, I practice with rattan sticks all the time. They don't make fencing models of the Espada Idaga or the Chris sword or stuff like that. They may make synthetics, but if I want to come to a steel tournament, there's really aren't any of those tools available for me to pick up and come to the tournament. Yeah. So having technology and having gear that represents everybody's practice, that can all participate in the same conversation is the other piece of accessibility. So accessible language, accessible technology, and I think by those two things, I think we get a lot more people into the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and let's go ahead and jump off from there, because we're over our hour of time, because we've had such a fun conversation. Our fancy camera died, so we're switching tech for a moment. But tell us about your projects, things you're working on right now that you'd like to plug.
Yeah. So as a Japanese sword arts practitioner that has been exposed to and fallen in love with steel fencing, I wanted gear that I could practice my art using. And so I've got a company that we're starting to build. It's we don't even have a name yet, but more to come soon. But anyway, we've developed a prototype steel fencing katana. So we've got a katana that we can use. We're quickly looking into the other models of steel fencing Japanese swords. So wakizashi, kokatana, nodachi. So basically a full library of sword lengths. I'm going to very soon have a sword that has the same reach as a fetter, and you guys are going to be in trouble.
It's going to be interesting.
And then the other thing that we've developed is a steel fencing jacket with one of the manufacturers out there is going to be manufacturing it white label for us. And so it looks like a gi. It looks like a gi. You can wear it under a hakama, but it covers up it's padded like a HEMA jacket. It covers up a lot of the holes that a normal gi would have, and it has an actual collar with a sword catcher to it. So it checks all of the safety boxes for a HEMA jacket, but looks like a Japanese
it looks
jacket.
Is that what you were showing? Kyle and I went up and met you in Tulsa a couple weeks back. Is that what you're showing us?
Yeah. Yep. That was the thing that I was showing you. And so we've got a jacket and we've got a sword, which were the first two items on our must-have checklist. And we're going to be developing more products as we go. Our next stage is going to very quickly branch into a Chinese style jacket and some Chinese style fencing weapons. And we're going right now for entry level gear. It's like I've worked very hard to make sure that we have a minimum cost product, so that because what we've got either HEMA practitioners that have a little bit of love for the Asian martial arts and may want to express that style, or may want to play around in it a little bit, or we've got Japanese sword artists or Asian sword artists that we need to convince that steel fencing is a good thing. And so if I'm, if it's a $600 sword or a $400 jacket, I'm not going to get anybody to do that on a whim. But going back to that accessibility, and specifically the accessibility of technology, I'm trying to get steel fencing appropriate gear made to fit the Asian aesthetic and provide the Asian technology.
So when do you expect those to be available to the general market? And can you predict a price point for the jacket? And
so let's see. So right now we've got a beta test going on. I've got a number of practitioners. Actually, I've got some folks in the UK, and see, we have nobody in Canada this time, but I've got somebody in Canada that wants to try this stuff out. But we've got beta testing going on to get more feedback from people, and these are more HEMA oriented folks. It's like, I have my students have already played in the gear and played with the sword plenty. So it seems great to us, but the folks that are used to steel fencing and steel fencing gear, we're now seeking the feedback from them. I am predicting that we will probably have our first, well, we're going to have a big pre-opening sale probably around June of next year. So give me 6 to 7 months.
Very cool.
And we're going to be selling everything in the store. We're going to have a fully stocked web store, and we're going to be selling everything as kind of a pre-sale to stock the store, stock amazing. The store, as it were. And then I'm hoping to have phase 2 gear. The Chinese gear is our next phase 2 by the end of next year, be available for sale. And so, hopefully 6 to 7 months and we'll be there, but we already have working prototypes. We're just putting the final touches on it. So
that's so cool.
So
I did notice you didn't answer the price question. Is that on purpose?
Oh, no. Sorry. I got lost. So, I think the price point is really is going to be a little hard to predict, because one of my biggest problems is shipping. Right now, the jacket is more expensive than I want it to be because I'm basically shipping them via FedEx or DHL or, whatever, pick your carrier. And so the shipping cost is really high. I'm hoping when we go into production that we've got some economy of scale. We can get the price point on the physical jacket down, and then we can ship via cargo and get the cargo price down quite a bit. And so my goal is to have at or below $200 for the jacket.
Excellent.
Again, trying to get that down as much as I can to make it accessible, but also create an operation that I can actually pay for itself, sustain itself.
Sure.
And then the sword is going to be in a similar price category. It's going to be less than $200.
Oh wow!
I'll buy one of those because I want one.
Yeah. And again, that's exactly what I want. Is I want people that will try this stuff out at this price point. Give Japanese sword arts and steel fencing a chance, because it's accessible. We can always make more premium, more expensive gear. That's not a problem.
a good point.
We need to get people in, and once we get them addicted to steel, then it's over for them.
Well, I just want more people to fight. I'm gonna be real honest. Yeah.
Yep.
Man, I'm really excited you're doing that. I get real excited that we have some more diversity in for the moment. We'll keep calling it the HEMA community. But I like what you're thinking. I like what you bring to the table. It's been really fun getting to know you over the last 6 months or a year or whatever, and I'm really glad you sat down and had this conversation with us. This has been really, really cool.
And ladies and gentlemen,
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jeff, the Ghost of Tulsa.
I think I named it.
Oh yeah.
You guys, I can't promote that name without seeming real egotistical. So you guys need to try to make that a thing.
Jeff Beeson, the Ghost of Tulsa.
The Ghost of Tulsa. It's going to be on the title, so don't think it's not going to happen. Thank you, Jeff. This has been Fighting Words. Y'all have a good one.
Have a good one, guys.
Yeah. Bye. All right. Thank you, Jeff.
Dude, that was awesome.
Oh.
Yeah, we went over, and it's because I was having so much fun talking with you.
Yeah.